Hey guys, tonight we begin along the banks of the Nile. Picture it. The desert air still warm, oil lamps flickering against temple walls, and that soft hiss of the river sliding past in the dark. It's the perfect backdrop for a story that isn't about what Egyptian masters could do to their slaves, but what they couldn't. And trust me, that list is shorter than a pharaoh's patience at a bad banquet. Now, if you're new here, I'm your tipsy historian. Pour yourself something. Maybe a glass of wine, a beer, or hey, if you're feeling fancy, a jug of Nile water that hopefully hasn't been upstream of a hippo. Whatever your poison, settle in and let's wander the Nile together. Before we dive in, quick thing, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this channel. I'm not here to guilt trip yet. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing who's listening. Someone could be watching from midnight in Cairo or 3 a.m. in Texas. It makes this whole history journey feel like we're all sitting around the same fire, swapping stories across time zones. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe let the night breeze in and relax. Tonight we're heading deep into the world of ancient Egypt to ask a strange question. When you owned another human being, what exactly couldn't you do to them? Grab your drink. Let's begin. When we think of slavery in Egypt, it's easy to imagine whips cracking in the sun, endless stone blocks being dragged toward pyramids. That image isn't wrong, but it isn't the whole truth either. In Egypt, slavery was a mixed bag of origins. War captives taken from Nubia, Libya, or the Levant, peasants who fell into debt and sold their labor, sometimes for life, and children who simply inherited the status of their parents. It was less of a one-size-fits-all system and more of a patchwork stitched together by conquest, poverty, and bureaucracy. And unlike the Romans, who legally filed slaves under the same category as a broken bench, Egyptians didn't strip them entirely of humanity. You were still a person, just a person who came with a receipt. That difference mattered. It meant slaves could pray, marry in their own informal ways, sometimes even hold land. They weren't free, but they weren't invisible either. Now, that didn't mean Egyptian masters could do whatever popped into their wine-soaked heads. There were limits, even in a society built on hierarchy. For one, killing a slave outright was dangerous, not just socially, but spiritually. Egyptians lived in a world haunted by gods who kept score. Murdering someone who carried a soul, a car, risked angering the divine accountants. You didn't want Osiris glaring at you from the afterlife balance sheet because you casually snuffed out your cook. Even neighbors might whisper, and in Egypt, reputation was as fragile as papyrus in the rain. Masters also couldn't deny their slaves a role in religion. Household rituals, temple ceremonies, slaves were part of that rhythm. If you tried to cut them off from sacred duties, you weren't just denying them, you were poking the gods in the eye. And nobody wanted divine backlash over something as small as refusing to let your servant light incense. Then there were festivals. The great state celebrations like Opet in Thebes weren't just for the elites parading in linen and gold. Even slaves had time away from the grind. Overworking them during these sacred days was a no-no. Imagine your boss calling you into work on Christmas morning, only the HR department is a crocodile god who eats rule breakers. The law of the land and the law of heaven agreed, give them the day off. So yes, slaves in Egypt lived hard lives. But their masters were not all-powerful. They had to navigate a system where even the lowest worker was plugged into the machinery of gods, festivals, and community. And if they overstepped, well, divine punishment was a far scarier thought than a slap on the wrist from some earthly judge. And speaking of punishments, here's where I have to pause and ask, if you've made it this far without subscribing, what exactly are you doing? Imagine being in Egypt, handed bread and beer for the afterlife, and saying, "No thanks, I'll starve in eternity." That's what ignoring the subscribe button feels like. If you really can't bring yourself to do it, then at least confess in the comments why you'd turn down eternal rations. The rest of us will be there, shaking our heads and sipping our drinks. Now, let's keep walking down the Nile, because things get stranger the closer you look at how Egyptians balanced power with belief. Most slaves in Egypt didn't spend their lives dragging pyramid stones until their backs snapped. In fact, by the time most of the monuments you're picturing were built, The system of forced labor looked different depending on where you ended up. Some were household slaves, folding linen, baking bread, raising children who technically weren't theirs but knew them better than their parents. Others worked in the fields, bent over wheat under the same sun that scorched the free farmers. And then there were the temple slaves, strange hybrids of servitude and sanctity, sweeping sacred courtyards, preparing offerings or chanting prayers they might not even believe in, but had to perform anyway. Now, masters had the whip, sure, but they couldn't just swing it endlessly. Egypt was a place obsessed with balance, with order, mart. Excessive cruelty didn't just make you a bad person, it made you suspicious in the eyes of both your neighbors and the gods. Beat a slave to death, and suddenly you weren't just a stern master, you were the sort of lunatic who might bring divine curses on the whole block. People didn't like that. Even temples could step in, wagging their fingers and reminding you that cruelty had limits. And then there was simple economic logic. If your slave was a trained scribe who could copy sacred texts, or a musician who kept your dinner parties lively, crippling them was the ancient equivalent of smashing your iPhone with a hammer because it dropped a call. Pointless, expensive, and you'd look like an idiot. Skilled slaves were valuable, investments of time and resources. Beating them into uselessness wasn't just immoral, it was bad business. Even the hardest field worker got a break sometimes, especially during the great festivals. When the Opet festival rolled through Thebes, or when the harvest was celebrated, slaves joined the singing, drinking, and parades. Imagine it as state-mandated overtime off. Everyone, even the lowest in the household, pulled into the swirl of incense, drums, and ritual. To deny them that was like dragging your kids to school on Christmas morning and wondering why the neighbors thought you were possessed. But here's the part that makes me laugh. Some of you are listening to all this, sipping your drink, nodding along, and still not subscribing. Which makes you exactly like the overseer who sneaks bread out of the workers' rations when nobody's looking. Cheap, sneaky, and absolutely going to get caught. If you're one of those people, fine. Own it. Drop your excuse in the comments so we can all judge you properly while the rest of us clink glasses and carry on. Now, let's wander a little deeper, because the personal lives of Egyptian slaves reveal just how many contradictions were hidden beneath the desert sun. Marriage among slaves in Egypt rarely looked like the tidy little contracts you see in modern rom-coms. There was no grand certificate pinned to papyrus that turned a servant into a citizen overnight. Instead, relationships grew in courtyards between pots of stew under awnings in the cracks of an otherwise rigid household. Two people would pair up, share a bed, raise children together, and the neighborhood, other servants, craftsmen, even the odd sympathetic overseer, treated that bond with a kind of practical respect. It wasn't legal marriage in the way the elite understood it, but it was real enough to shape lives. You married for company, for help with the washing, for someone to sing while you hauled bricks at dawn. That counts for something. Children followed the status of the mother more often than the father, so offspring usually entered into the same world as their parents. Bound labor, familiar faces, and the same small joys. Yet there were limits. Temple slaves and those dedicated to the god's household occupied a slightly different lane. If a child was born under the aegis of a temple, that child was often treated as temple property, less a bargaining chip at market and more a member of a religious workforce. That didn't mean they lived in luxury. It meant a private owner couldn't always just pack them off to the highest bidder. In practice, families did split, masters did sell, and the sorrow was real. But the existence of temple ownership and communal ties introduced frictions that a purely transactional system would have lacked. Names in Egypt were stubborn little things. Unlike in Rome, where a new owner might rename you like they were picking a new utensil, many enslaved people kept their birth names, Hapi, Merit, Ka'em, Werit. Those names carried memory, language, ancestry. They were a daily defiance. Sure, masters could call someone Runner, or that one by the oven, and nicknames stuck the way spilled wine stains do, but outright erasing a name wasn't always the norm. There's something human in that. To be called by the name your mother gave you is a tiny, private victory. Still, honorifics, titles, and the right to be addressed as anything fancy Those were reserved for free people. You could be happy forever, but you'd never be Mr. Happy on a tax scroll. Appearance mattered in Egypt, the way logos matter in our world. Linen quality, jewelry, even the way you plaited hair signaled class. Masters couldn't simply elevate a slave into elite status by slapping a gold collar on them and sending them out to dine with senators. Egyptian society kept those markers tight. It's not just snobbery, the visual language of status had political teeth. If servants paraded in the finery of the elite, the social order would fray, and someone with more power than your household might take offense. That said, within the household, masters dressed slaves for roles. The household cupbearer might wear cleaner linen on banquet nights. The musician would have small ornaments to look the part. But that costume was still a costume. Function over full acceptance. If you're finding yourself smirking at the absurdity of it all, history's little ironies and the fact that fashion police existed 3,000 years ago, then maybe you should subscribe. If you're watching this far and still won't hit the button, you're basically the person who steals extra bread from the kitchen and then tells the rest of us they're generous. Be honest. Drop your reason in the comments so we can all have a good communal eye roll. There's a tenderness buried in all these small resistances. Names kept, unions formed, children carried through temple thresholds. They don't undo the injustice of slavery, but they show how people made pockets of life inside it. Come on, pour another sip and let's keep walking. The Nile keeps its secrets, and we've only just begun pulling at the threads. Temples in Egypt weren't just marble Instagram backdrops. They were living places with rules thicker than a priest's beard. Walk into a sanctuary and you crossed into a different kind of law, one that belonged to the gods first and the household second. That meant, in practical terms, that if a slave ran for the protection of a temple precinct, a master couldn't just barge in and drag them out like a bad tenant. The precincts functioned as a kind of moral and sometimes practical asylum. It's the ancient version of ducking into a church when you're being chased. Only the person chasing you risks more than a scolding from the vicar. They risk public outrage and a priestly headache that could last seasons. Because religion in Egypt braided itself into every part of life, slaves weren't pushed to the margins of ritual. They were woven into it. Household shrines weren't decorative props, they were shared spaces. A servant lighting a little lamp to the household gods, offering bread, a bit of beer, was performing both piety and social glue. Those small, repetitive acts mattered. They marked you as part of the household fabric, even if you slept in a different courtyard. And when large public rituals rolled through, processions, seasonal rites, the noisy, intoxicating business of placating gods, slaves took part. Participation was both duty and protection. To be part of ritual life was to participate in the symbolic order that everyone, from pharaoh to potwasher, depended on. Because of that religious entanglement, masters sometimes had obligations harder to dodge than taxes. Burial was one of them. In Egypt, funerary rites weren't optional. They were the contract that kept the soul's paperwork in order. A proper burial meant food in the afterlife, a stable place for the car to hang out, and a markedly lower chance of being haunted by a disgruntled ancestor. For slaves who had labored decades for a household, a master could be socially and in some cases ritualistically expected to provide a decent burial. It wasn't always generous altruism. It was economy and piety braided together. Neglecting a burial could bring gossip, loss of face, and in the minds of many, real spiritual trouble. Temple links made other kinds of transactions tricky too. Children tied to temple service, or slaves owned by a god's estate, were less easy to sell off like a pair of old sandals. You couldn't always treat temple property the same way you treated personal chattels. There were hands you didn't want to offend, and rituals that complicated casual transfers of people. And because religion shaped reputation, masters learned that cruelty toward the pious or neglect of the dead wasn't just morally ugly, it was bad optics, with practical consequences. If you've enjoyed the way this unravels, these small seams where faith rewrote the rules, consider tapping subscribe. If you've made it this far and are still refusing, remember the Egyptians believed the gods punished selfishness. Watching this far without subscribing? That's basically confessing you want to get cursed in the afterlife. If you insist on tempting Anubis, explain yourself in the comments. Keep your cup full and your curiosity ready. The next bend of the Nile reveals how economics and ritual tangled up rites and resistance in ways that would surprise the most cynical accountant. Economics in Egypt always carried a twist, because even in bondage, money had a way of slipping through the cracks. Slaves weren't just hands in the field or feet on the threshing floor. They sometimes handled resources of their own. Picture a herdsman tending goats along the riverbank. Those animals belong to the master, but the milk or offspring might be negotiated, traded, tucked away. It was the Egyptian cousin of the Roman peculium, that little personal fund. Only here, it wasn't always coins jingling in a pouch. It might be a few jars of grain, a couple of tools, or even a donkey that everyone politely agreed was his, even if the ownership papers said otherwise. Masters weren't free to seize everything, either. Goods tied to temple service or allotted for religious tasks were off limits. If the high priest at Karnak had marked a sack of barley for offerings, even the most arrogant noble thought twice before stealing it from the servant hauling it through the courtyard. Taking temple-allotted resources was like raiding the petty cash of the gods, punishable by more than just a bad reputation. You didn't want divine auditors knocking at your tomb for eternity. Some slaves even became entrepreneurs in their own right. There are scraps of records of slaves running workshops, managing vineyards, or overseeing craft production. They were still owned, but they generated profit, networked with free artisans, and sometimes managed larger estates than freeborn farmers. It was capitalism in a collar. Your body belonged to someone else, but your hustle might make both of you richer. The clever ones carved out leverage in those margins, proving that the ancient world never underestimated someone with a good business plan. And then there were the state slaves, the pharaoh's property. These weren't just bodies to be bought and sold like second-hand sandals at the market. They were attached to the royal machine. Temple slaves, quarry workers, and certain labor forces fell under the umbrella of crown property, which meant individual masters couldn't shuffle them around at will. Trading a state-owned worker was like trying to sell your government-issued laptop on Craigslist. Tempting, but guaranteed to end with a very awkward conversation. Economics added a strange kind of leash to power. Masters could own you, but they couldn't always control every jar, every tool, every drop of milk your work produced. The system bent just enough to give slaves slivers of control, and sometimes those slivers mattered. Now, if you're still hanging out here, learning about the entrepreneurial side of Egyptian slavery, and you haven't subscribed, you're basically the guy skimming profits from someone else's granary and hoping nobody notices. Spoiler, we've noticed. If you're proud of that, fine. Drop your excuse in the comments so we can all shake our heads together while pouring another drink. The Nile keeps winding, and next it carries us into the shadow of the courts and punishments, where law and power tried to set limits, and often failed. The Egyptian courts were dusty, crowded affairs where justice was supposed to be handed down with the calm authority of Ma'at, truth, balance, cosmic order. But if you were a slave, you didn't stroll in, roll out a papyrus contract, and sue your master for back pay. The system wasn't built for that. What you could do was whisper your case to a patron, a free person with enough status to nudge your complaint into the ears of the local officials. It was justice by proxy, and it meant the power of your voice depended heavily on who was willing to carry it. Think of it like sending a lawyer into court. Only the lawyer is also the guy who can fire you from your day job if you make him angry. When it came to testimony, Egypt played it differently than Rome. Roman law liked to squeeze confessions out of slaves with whips and fire, the ancient equivalent of, "we'll just torture the truth out of you." Egyptians, on the other hand, weren't quite as systematic about it. Torture wasn't standard protocol, though restrictions still meant that a slave's word didn't weigh as much as a free person's. Courts would accept testimony, but always with a little asterisk beside it, a kind of built-in suspicion. Justice in Egypt leaned more on ritual and reputation than bruises and broken bones, which, depending on your perspective, was either merciful or just another flavor of control. Some punishments were explicitly off the table. Certain mutilations risked offending the gods because the body was considered a vessel that needed to be intact for the afterlife. Cut off someone's nose or gouge out an eye, and you weren't just punishing a body, you were tampering with a soul's eternal paperwork. That was bad form in Egypt, and bad form had cosmic consequences. Better to beat a man than to risk him showing up before Osiris missing half his face and pointing the finger back at you. Even collective punishment had limits. In Rome or Persia, wiping out an entire household might be seen as efficient cruelty. Egypt discouraged that kind of scorched earth approach. Pharaohs and officials didn't want whole slave communities destabilized. Too costly, too disruptive, too messy for the orderly flow of Ma'at. Punish the guilty, yes. Make an example, sure. But slaughter everyone under the same roof? That was chaos, and chaos was the enemy of Egyptian kingship. So even in the grim machinery of courts and punishments, limits crept in. Not kindness, not compassion, just the cold calculations of religion, order, and politics. And if you've stuck with me through trials, testimony, and afterlife paperwork and still won't subscribe, then you're the guy in court refusing to free his own scribe. Everyone's staring at you, wondering how you'll justify yourself. Go on. Drop your defense statement in the comments. We'll be the jury, drinks in hand. Now let's move from the courts into the living fabric of culture itself, where food, music, and even festival games mark the boundaries of what masters couldn't touch. Even the food of Egypt was political. On festival days, the city smelled like a banquet you didn't get an invitation to, bread steaming from communal ovens, vats of beer fizzing, piles of salted fish and onions laid out like offerings. Masters couldn't simply lock their slaves away and keep the rations for themselves. Those state and communal distributions were part ritual, part social contract. Denying someone their bread and beer on a holy day wasn't just petty cruelty. It was public shame. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of turning up your nose at a company holiday dinner and then wondering why nobody wants to sit next to you afterwards. Temple service bought more than spiritual cover. It bought shelter. Slaves attached to temples or godly estates generally lived in decent, stable quarters near the precincts. Basic, yes, but safe in the back courtyards and alley beds many household slaves endured. A private master couldn't simply shove a temple servant into the gutter without provoking priests and neighbors. Temples had property and reputation to protect, and they weren't shy about reminding anyone who tried to flout those norms that gods had long memories and communities had teeth. And then there were the entertainers. Musicians, singers, dancers. If you were talented enough to make a room stop and listen, you had leverage. A skilled harpist or a troop leader in an elite household enjoyed protections a general labourer did not. Injure the performer who makes your banquet memorable, and the whole social calendar notices. These roles were the ancient version of being a valued contractor. You were still owned, but your craft bought you a kind of social immunity. Your music could be the very thing that saved you from being thrown back into the worst work. Work itself followed the river's moods. During the flood season, when the Nile took over the fields and the work was chaotic and dangerous, there were limits on what masters could demand. You didn't send the weakest, the sick, or the untrained into the flood's teeth and call it management. Partly because it would be bad for business, and partly because killing off your labour force right before harvest was dumb even by ancient standards. There's a bureaucratic pragmatism here that looks oddly modern. Safety in the face of seasonal risk, mandated breaks during sacred times, and a loose set of expectations about who got what kind of work when. If this little tour of bread, beds and banquets has you nodding along and you haven't subscribed yet, that's like standing in the middle of Opet, smelling the feast, and choosing to sniff politely from the sidelines. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe. If not, at least write your defense in the comments so we can all judge you with full moral clarity. Freedom in Egypt wasn't a straight road. It was a winding path with sudden turns and hidden doors. A slave could spend a lifetime in bondage and still find the exit, not because the system was kind, but because it was practical. Masters freed slaves for loyalty, for decades of service, for raising children who grew up into trusted attendants. Sometimes temples intervened, buying freedom for workers dedicated to sacred duties, as though the gods themselves had written a letter of recommendation. Manumission wasn't common, but it happened enough to remind everyone that bondage wasn't always the last word. And when freedom came, it could come with perks. In some cases, freedmen found themselves slipping through inheritance loopholes, suddenly eligible to own a strip of land or a cluster of date palms. Imagine spending half your life serving in someone else's vineyard, only to wake up one day and discover that the vines now answered to you. It didn't erase the past, but it offered a foothold into the fragile stability of Egyptian society. Others found freedom through adoption. A household might absorb a trusted servant into its family, folding them into inheritance and lineage, as though blood could be rewritten by loyalty. It was rare, but not unheard of. And for those few, it was a transformation as stunning as walking out of a tomb into daylight. A former slave could become, on paper and in practice, kin. And freed slaves weren't just silent ex-servants drifting on the edge of society. Some became patrons in their own right, stepping into administrative posts, handling accounts, supervising estates. They were living proof that the line between master and slave wasn't always a chasm. Sometimes it was a crack wide enough to slip through with enough patience, skill, or sheer good luck. But here's the cruel irony. Freedom didn't always extend to the children. Picture a slave finally being freed, only to watch their son or daughter remain bound, still answering to another hand. That gap between generations could sting worse than chains. And honestly, that's what it feels like when you enjoy all this content, but won't subscribe. You take the reward and leave the next generation, me, the channel, this whole late-night gathering, still stuck in chains. If you're that stubborn, fine. Write your excuse in the comments so we can all shake our heads in unison. Now, refill your glass, because we're about to step out of the intimate world of households and inheritance and into the wider stage, where Egypt wasn't the only empire drawing lines between power and restraint. Egypt wasn't an island of rules. It was one stop on a very crowded river. Cross the border and the script changed. The neighbors borrowed bits from each other, copied each other's worst habits, and then added local twists. Let's float over a few of those other shores. Mesopotamia was the place of city contracts and bakery ledgers. Debt could turn a free man into someone else's labor, fall behind on grain, and you might find yourself working off a loan in someone else's courtyard. The Code of Hammurabi doesn't read like mercy, it rarely does, but it does show a system where slavery had rules. Slaves could be bought and sold, but there were also provisions for family ties, for redemption, and for legal recourse in certain cases. Temples in Mesopotamia ran houses and lands of their own. Some people entered service as part of religious duties. Ancient writers whisper about ritual sexual services in certain sanctuaries, but modern scholars argue over what those accounts actually mean, whether they were formalized sacred prostitution or later misreadings of complex rites. Either way, the point is clear. Theocratic institutions shaped what owners could and couldn't do, often putting priests and temple law in the role of unofficial HR. The Persian Empire liked scale. When you're ruling from Sardis to Susa, the household of the king looks less like a home and more like a state department. Royal slaves and eunuchs staffed palaces, guarded treasuries, ran stables, and sometimes held real power. In some cases, being a royal servant meant protection. The crown's reach made casual cruelty risky, and the pharaoh equivalent's household had its own logic of privilege and punishment. Women and people taken in diplomatic settlements could become instruments of policy. Marriages, concubines, and gift people reinforced alliances. That made certain categories of people politically sensitive commodities. You didn't simply flog or flout them without drawing consequences that could echo through courts and courts of power. Greece split its story into very different chapters. In Athens, slavery was woven into city life. Households, workshops, even state services used enslaved labor. Many Athenian slaves worked in the gig economy, hired out, given tasks, sometimes allowed to run small side enterprises and occasionally to buy their freedom. Manumission existed. It was messy but possible. Sparta, though, offers the dark contrast. Helots were a subjugated majority bound to the land, state-owned and ritualized into second class, terrorized on purpose to keep them manageable. The Spartan cryptia, part right, part internal policing, was a sanctioned brutality designed to remind Helots of their place. In short, Greek systems ranged from urban, negotiable servitude to institutionalized serfdom so brutal it became a central feature of state security. Nubia and Kush complicate the map further. These were not mirror images of Egypt, nor were they simple suppliers of captives. They were sophisticated kingdoms with their own social orders. Sometimes Nubians were enslaved by Egyptians, sometimes they were allies, sometimes they ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty. Captives might be integrated into households, become soldiers, or enter temple service. The lines between captive, servant, and soldier could blur. In Kushite courts you find both continuity and innovation, aristocratic retinues, war captives pressed into service, and cultural exchange that made the region's social fabric flexible in ways outsiders often missed. Compare them and a pattern emerges. Owners had sweeping powers, but power operates inside ecosystems. Religion curtailed brutality because gods were public relations disasters if offended. Economics limited excess because a crippled artisan is bad accounting. Politics imposed boundaries because some people, temple personnel, royal functionaries, helots in Sparta, were not disposable without consequences. In each region, the limits looked different. Mesopotamia's contractualism, Persia's courtly protocols, Greece's civic variations, and Nubia's frontier blending all placed distinct checks on ownership. If this tour of borders and bargains has you curious for more, hit subscribe. There's a whole world of awkward ancient HR policies I'm dying to read with you. And tell me in the comments, which of these systems surprised you most, or which one would you least like as your landlord in the Bronze Age? Let's argue about it while the Nile keeps moving. And so we circle back to the Nile, that endless ribbon of water winding through the desert, carrying boats heavy with grain, with stone, with stories older than memory. The temples still glow in the torchlight, their columns watching centuries slip by, and the horizon stretches out like it always has, wide, silent, eternal. It's the same river that fed pharaohs and field hands, scribes and slaves, the same current that kept Egypt alive, while also drowning so many in its hierarchies. What we've seen tonight isn't a neat tale of cruelty and compassion. It's a reminder that slavery in Egypt or anywhere else is always about power, and power always comes with limits. Some of those limits were practical. Don't ruin the worker who makes you rich. Some were spiritual. Don't offend the gods with cruelty that twists the cosmic order. And some were cultural. Give bread and beer during festivals. Let even the lowest hand dance when the drums of Opet thundered down the street. But between those limits, between the rules and rituals, there were cracks where humanity showed through. A name that stayed the same when everything else was taken. A couple who made a family in the shadows of a courtyard. A child carried into temple service instead of being sold away. These are the small defiances that remind us. History isn't just rulers and monuments. It's the quiet fight of ordinary people to stay human in systems built to deny them. If you've subscribed already, thank you. You're part of the little fire we've built here along the Nile. One more voice keeping these stories alive. But if you've joined me for almost an hour of wandering, listening and drinking in this past, and you still won't subscribe, well then you're the traveller who eats the bread, drinks the beer, listens to the music and walks away without even nodding at the host. At least drop your reason in the comments. I'll be waiting with bread, beer and judgment. The river keeps flowing, the lamps burn low and the stories stretch on. Until next time, keep your cup full and your curiosity restless.